I'm Tim Constantine, and from New York City, this is the Capitol Hill Show. In 2024, American voters will be asked to make a choice between two very different candidates. They have different personalities, different histories, and different beliefs. In January of next year, one of them will be sworn in as the 47th President of the United States. As president, he or she will be required to make a lifetime appointment, maybe even more than one, should any vacancies occur on the Supreme Court of the United States. Justice Clarence Thomas is 75 years old, and Samuel Alito is 73 years old. Both are very conservative. The next president, if he or she is asked to replace either or both of those two, will make appointments that may change the face of the Supreme Court for the next 30 years.
The American government is made up of three branches. The executive branch is headed by the President of the United States. He oversees various departments, including the State Department, Department of Defense, Department of Treasury, and much more. The legislative branch includes 435 members of the U.S. House of Representatives and 100 United States senators. By law, all government expenditures must begin with legislation from the House of Representatives, and all legislation of any type must be approved by both the House and the Senate and must be signed by the President in order to become law. The third branch of government is the judicial branch. At the top of the federal judiciary is the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ensures not only that the law of the land is followed, but also that the laws and actions of government fall within the boundaries created by the United States Constitution. The Supreme Court is made up of 9 members. Throughout American history, it's had different configurations, but for more than 150 years, the Supreme Court has had 9 members. Each Supreme Court justice is appointed for life, meaning unless they retire, die in office, or are impeached and convicted of wrongdoing, they stay as long as they want. Only when a justice retires or dies does the President select a new Supreme Court justice. The President does so with the advice and consent of the United States Senate. There's no way to control fate, of course, but on average, presidents typically appoint 2 Supreme Court justices during their time in office. George Herbert Walker Bush appointed 2 Supreme Court justices. Bill Clinton appointed 2. George W. Bush appointed 2. Barack Obama appointed 2. Donald Trump, however, in only 4 years as president, had the opportunity to appoint 3 Supreme Court justices, and Joe Biden, during the past 4 years, has only filled 1 vacancy. Until recent years, the process was mostly apolitical, with both sides seeming to realize the integrity of the court was more important than any political agenda. In the last 30 years, however, that has not always been the case. Some Supreme Court Justice Senate hearings have turned into circuses, with false accusations intended to sully the reputation of the nominee. As we look forward to 2025 and beyond, the next President of the United States, if history is any guide, may well appoint 2 Supreme Court justices. Because those justices will have lifetime appointments, it means the next President of the United States could have an impact on the law of the land for the next 30 years or more. Senator Mike Lee of Utah has a background that may make him uniquely qualified to talk about the Supreme Court.
Senator Mike Lee, thanks for joining us on the Capitol Hill Show.
Thanks for having me.
Your family business, so to speak, has been the law. Your dad was Solicitor General, your brother's a federal judge, you are sometimes on the short list for the Supreme Court of the United States and sitting United States Senator. But the law is something clearly you and your family, A, know, and B, take very serious. Some have suggested a variety of things. President Biden allegedly has a new idea coming out for how to handle the Supreme Court. They might put term limits on justices and so on. All right, what are your thoughts when you hear changes, many of which sound as though they may be politically motivated, to this body that's been around since day one?
Well, first of all, President Biden is doing this not because he wants to ease administrative burdens on the court, not because he thinks that the justices are overworked. He's doing it because he wants to remake the Supreme Court in his own image. So let's take term limits, for example. On the term limits question, the Constitution doesn't allow that. The Article 3 of the Constitution says that they'll serve presumptive life tenured terms on good behavior, meaning in the absence of impeachment or removal, they'll stay on there until they die or retire. So that one would require a constitutional amendment. That's a pretty heavy lift. 2/3 of both houses of Congress have got to agree to it and then get it ratified by 3/4 of the states. Seems unlikely to happen. But his other point seems to be to pack the court. Now, I think this has been his plan all along. He called that a bonehead idea back in 1983, and it truly is that.
And for people who aren't familiar, when we say pack the court, they would like to expand the court and appoint all of the new justices themselves.
Yes, and here again, not because they think that the court is overworked or that it's too small, but because he wants to change the rulings coming out of the court to more closely reflect his own political preferences.
Guy Smith served as a White House advisor to President Bill Clinton and served as a campaign spokesman for Hillary Clinton in 2016 and Joe Biden in 2020. He now represents the Kamala Harris campaign.
Guy Smith, thanks for joining us on the Capitol Hill Show.
Great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
The Harris campaign has some momentum going right now. The Trump campaign is convinced they can still overcome any deficit they see now and win in November. There's some issues that are key to both of them. If you're a Trump fan, economics seem to side in your favor on the polls, or the border seems to be in your favor. If you're a Harris fan, abortion is a big leader for her. The one that seems to kind of skate sometimes is the Supreme Court of the United States. The president makes the appointment when there is a vacancy on the Supreme Court. So how important is it to voters, to the American public, as to who the 47th president of the United States is when it comes to appointing future Supreme Court justices?
It's very important to the country, and it's very important to our form of government. The average voter may not focus on it as much in the past, but today, because of the Supreme Court Roe versus Wade decision overturning the right of women to abortion, where we are is there is a very high level of awareness on the importance of the Supreme Court and the impact that it can have on everybody, and women in particular. We saw this manifest itself in Kansas and in Ohio, where the abortion issue was on the ballot. And they both, the abortion side won overwhelmingly in red states. And so going forward, the appointment of more justices when one steps down is very important. And I think in this cycle, more important than maybe certainly in recent times.
The Supreme Court of the United States has changed some historically, but has been basically the same structure since 1871. The Biden-Harris administration has proposed some changes to the structure of the Supreme Court. Among those are the idea right now, if you serve on the court, a justice has a lifetime appointment. Unless they have some malfeasance and are forced out, they can stay until the day they die if they want. One of the proposals has been that there should be term limits. Tell me where the Harris campaign stands on that.
Well, we see an inability of the Supreme Court to police itself. The rest of the judicial system does, the Supreme Court does not. And we also see extreme decision-making. Clarence Thomas, you mentioned, is one of the extremists from a point of view of Vice President Harris and the Harris campaign and Democrats generally. So I think that an ability to have some additional influence over the complexion of the court is very important. Now you're thinking, well, it doesn't say that in the Constitution. It also didn't say in the Constitution that Mitch McConnell could block an appointment to the Supreme Court so that the next president could do it and not the sitting president. So this is one of the frustrations that you're speaking about, and it is giving yet more energy to the Harris campaign that might not otherwise be there on an issue that's sort of in the weeds on the legal issues around the Supreme Court.
One of the other ideas has been to expand the size of the Supreme Court. It's been 9 members, as I said, since 1871, but some would say maybe it would be better served if it was larger. Where do you think that should go?
Traditionally, the Supreme Court had a sitting member for each of the circuits. Well, there are more circuits than there are justices today, so there's the thought that maybe we should have more justices. And at one point there were 6, now there are 9, and so that is an ongoing conversation. I think it might be a good idea because especially when you have Mitch McConnell type kind of actions that just thwart the will of the people, thwart the Constitution. I know technically he was okay to do that, but not really.
Court packing is itself not unconstitutional, but it has an impact that is decidedly anti-constitutional. Let me explain what I mean. Congress does have the power to decide the size of the court. We haven't always been at 9 justices. It's only been for the last 153 years or so that it's been at 9. Congress could change that, but it is unwise to try to do it because it would always be perceived as being there to give an undue political advantage to the current president of the United States. Once you break that seal, you start going down that path, you can't contain the damage. It sets off an almost nuclear chain reaction. If Democrats were to, heaven forbid, win the presidency, regain the majority in the House and keep the majority in the Senate, I have no doubt now that Joe Biden will try to do that if he were to succeed in that. And if that were to happen, the next time Republicans retook the White House, the House, and the Senate, they would then do the same thing.
So you might have Biden expanded to, say, 15, and he would appoint 6. But then
Yes.
4 years later, you might have the Republicans say, okay, so be it. It's now going to be a 21 justice.
Yes.
And it just becomes...
Is exactly what will happen. And before you know it, it looks less like a court and more like the intergalactic Senate in the Star Wars movies. And it behaves less like a judicial body and more like a political body. And that's what we can't have. Look, despots, tyrants, authoritarians everywhere, one of the first things they do is rein in their judiciary to make sure that there is no truly independent judicial system. In all countries over many centuries, this is what they have to do. And so we can't have this in America. And I make the case in Saving 9 that court packing is just a bad idea. We should always reject it, regardless of who's proposing it.
You mentioned justices stay for their lifetime or unless they are impeached. They can choose to retire, but they can't be forced out unless they're impeached. AOC has just filed some papers on the House side, filed a bill to try to impeach 2 members of the court, both of whom are perceived as very conservative. Is there any merit whatsoever to her complaint?
None, zero whatsoever. I mean, look, this is paranoid science fiction fantasy that she's engaging in on this. And it's even worse than that. It is really just a thinly veiled effort to say, I don't like how they rule, and so I'm going to try to get rid of them. There is nothing that they have done that is remotely unethical or illegal. She's using out of context quotes, half-truths built on half-truths that she sews together in a really deceptive fashion. Ultimately, what Justices Alito and Thomas, the 2 who I believe she's going after, what they're most guilty of is interpreting the law and the Constitution based on what the law and the Constitution say, rather than on the basis of what liberal law professors wish they said. And that is the ultimate offense.
And just a final note on that, because isn't that the intent of having a lifetime appointment, is that you are no longer tethered to some political agenda or trying to worry about whether or not you might have your job that could potentially sway you on one issue or not. You are simply reviewing the Constitution.
That's the whole point. Whole point of an independent judiciary, the whole point of the presumptive life tenure, is that you're there to just do your job. And that's why we should always pick those people who are dedicated to the rule of law, who understand that our laws consist of words, words have meaning, and your job as a judge when interpreting a law, a statute or a provision of the Constitution is to figure out what those words meant and the public understanding of them at the time of their enactment or their adoption into the Constitution.
Would you feel that the expansion is a good idea if Donald Trump is victorious in November?
No, not at all. I think he's a danger to the country. Dictator on day one. Sorry, and he isn't going to win anyway, so it doesn't matter. I mean, we're seeing the trending in the polls, from the moment Vice President Harris became the nominee, the polls have continually and consistently trended towards her. They're not static. Just this morning, another poll is out, and her lead has expanded slightly. And she's not ahead in all the swing states, but she is ahead in some. And I think I'm using the word trending on purpose because the trending is consistently towards her. And you're seeing that as it's a result of the energy that came out of the Chicago Convention and has continued.
There's a great statue, there's great paintings and images of Lady Justice with a blindfold. She is supposed to be blind and simply weigh the facts and make a decision. But this past year, we've seen Donald Trump in court in multiple jurisdictions, in local, in state, in federal. We've seen him in a variety of geographic locations. Some of the charges are from things from 8 years old or longer. Some of them are from a year ago, but by some amazing coincidence, they are all coming due. They're all coming to the courtroom in an election year. Are we getting too political in the courtroom? Are we seeing that really happen?
What you're describing, Tim, is the politicization of prosecutorial resources. And that's scary because in each of these cases, President Trump's got 4 separate indictments, 2 state, 2 federal, pending against them. They all have somewhat different theories focused on different events. But one thing that they all have in common is that I think we can all agree not one of them would have been brought against him were he not Joe Biden's political opponent. He would never have been charged with these things if he were citizen Donald Trump, if he were just former President Donald Trump, or somebody else for the same conduct. This is wrong.
I ran the same question past Vice President Harris's surrogate, Mr. Smith. When we talk about the court system, President Trump has had no shortage of legal challenges this year. And they have been in local court, in state court, and in federal court. They have been in New York, in Georgia, in Florida, in the District of Columbia. The charges range from things that occurred 30 years ago to things that happened 10 years ago to things that happened last year. Is it a coincidence that all of those are coming to fruition in an election year?
Well, if he was just a bankrupt real estate developer in New York, no one would really care. He's former president. 34 felony counts against a former president, inciting an insurrection of a sitting president. I mean, come on. I mean, it's nobody would care if he was just one of his bankrupt Atlantic City casinos, but they care big time because it affects every American.
You mentioned the Supreme Court, in your opinion, doesn't have the ability to police itself. AOC introduced articles of impeachment for 2 members of the Supreme Court, 2 justices. Does Vice President Harris support the effort to remove 2 members of the court?
What Vice President Harris supports is that the Supreme Court needs to reform itself and that it needs to report gifts, which for some reason some justices haven't been reporting. So I think if that kind of reform, and nothing extra, just do what the rest of the judges, the federal judges do, follow the same rules.
You may have noticed earlier when Harris surrogate Guy Smith said Trump is a danger.
I think he's a danger to the country. Dictator on day one.
It is well known that he admires dictators, wants to be a dictator on day one.
This is a guy who believes raw power, intimidation, domination is what should be done.
The danger to democracy line is one that's been picked up by the LA Times, the Atlantic, New York Magazine, and perhaps most importantly was also used by would-be assassin Ryan Ruth. After the first assassination attempt on Donald Trump, Senator Lee says he formed an idea to lower the temperature, the anger, and the violence in the political realm.
I issued a statement. I issued it jointly with my friend Robert O'Brien, who was President Trump's national security advisor, saying this is really a crisis, and in this crisis we need to take down the temperature. And the best way that can happen would be for President Biden to ask for the dismissal of all criminal charges pending against him. He can ask for that directly as President of the United States as to the 2 federal indictments, and for the other 2, he could call on the governors of Georgia and New York, respectively, and ask that those be dismissed as well.
Looking back, some presidents have selected their nominations to the Supreme Court based on identity politics. When Joe Biden ran for president in 2020, he pledged not to find the best candidate for the high court, but to appoint a black woman to the bench.
And I am especially grateful for the care that you have taken in discharging your constitutional duty in service of our democracy with all that is going on in the world today.
By promising a diversity hire, Biden cut hundreds of highly qualified judges from even being considered. For his part, Donald Trump, when running for president the first time, published a list of high-quality candidates and promised that his eventual choice would come from that list. And his choices did indeed come from the list. In 2024, Harris has not mentioned a single name she would consider. With the ideological control of the Supreme Court in the balance, it would seem that reporters and media of all type would want to know who Harris would choose. An interesting aside in this discussion of the Supreme Court, Senator Lee has been on Donald Trump's short list for potential Supreme Court justices.
This may be a little unfair, but I've got to ask you, if the president is reelected, if President Trump is reelected and is sworn in January, and if there is a vacancy on the Supreme Court of the United States and President Trump is trying to figure out who that will be. You're a young man, you're what, 53? 53 years old?
I'm 53, but I read at the level of a 54-year-old.
Fair enough. If he picks up the phone and he calls you and he says, Mike, I would like you to serve on the Supreme Court of the United States, is that something you would consider?
Look, if the President of the United States asked me to consider that, I would consider it. But I want to make very clear, Tim, I've got the job I want. I sought out this job. I've sought it out and gotten it now 3 times. I enjoy my job very much. But yeah, look, if vacancy were to come up and he wants to talk about that, of course I'll talk to him about it.
We've stressed that the purpose of the Supreme Court is to interpret the law, specifically the United States Constitution, without regard to political parties, political impact, or the social whims of the moment. It's entirely possible, of course, for intelligent, reasonable people to look at the same thing and come to different conclusions. Thus, 9 justices, and the majority rules. 7, 8, or all 9 justices agree on more issues than many people realize. But a 5-4 vote on controversial issues always brings out critics of the High Court. The current makeup of the court looks like this. Justices Thomas and Alito most consistently see issues through a conservative lens. Justices Sotomayor, Kagan, and Brown-Jackson typically see issues through a liberal lens. Justices Gorsuch and Kavanaugh's opinion seem to lean to the right on most, but not all, issues. Justice Coney Barrett has been right of center, and Chief Justice John Roberts has been on both sides, with opinions in favor of Obamacare and gay marriage infuriating court watchers on the right. The President of the United States has many responsibilities in day-to-day decisions that impact not only every American, but the entire world. One of the most consequential is the selection of Supreme Court justices. It's in those lifetime appointments that the 47th American president may have his or her greatest long-term impact.